Young Rupert, the making of the Murdoch empire. For half a century, the Murdoch media empire and its polarizing patriarch have swept across the globe, shaking up markets and democracies in their wake. But how did it all start? In September 1953, a 22-year-old Rupert Murdoch landed in Adelaide, fresh from Oxford with a radical reputation. And the young and brash son of Sir Keith Murdoch, it is, if you like, the origin story of Rupert Murdoch. Young Rupert, delighted to say that joining me live on the line from Australia is the author of Young Rupert, Walter Marsh. Walter, good morning to you.
Hi, Giles. Thanks for having me.
No, pleasure's all mine. Whereabouts are you, by the way, on the planet today?
I'm in Adelaide.
Very nice.
So where it all started for Rupert.
Exactly. We're at ground zero in the Murdoch empire. Because we tend to think of Murdoch as, you know, like him or loathe him. You tend to think of him as sort of this perpetual sort of mature figure. But obviously he had to start somewhere. So give us the backstory, if you will.
Yeah, so really it starts here in Adelaide. So I've lived here my entire life. And for my whole lifetime, Adelaide has been one of Australia's most concentrated media markets. It's this one paper town, and you know, for the last 30 years, it's been dominated by the Advertiser, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch's company. And I also, as I grew up, realised that for a long time it was the headquarters for the global Murdoch empire. Which, you know, just to give you a sense of Adelaide as a place, you know, it's maybe the third or fourth biggest city in Australia. It's not usually described as the center of anyone's universe. So the fact that this global empire was based here for a long time always seemed like a bit of a curiosity. And when I started getting into, you know, research and writing and history, I started to unpick the origin story of that. And the reason is because, yeah, as you said in that introduction, in the 1950s in Adelaide, this was the site of Rupert's succession. It was the place where he inherited what was a comparatively small media operation from his father and fought some of the first battles of his career as he fought to kind of carve a place for himself as a newspaper proprietor. And so this was the site where you really see the mogul, the global mogul he would become, really form and come into his own. And, you know, looking back at obviously the end of his career, one way or another, he retired just after the book came out, which was very generous of him in terms of timing for sales and things. But yeah, looking back when he is this older figure, and he has been for decades, it seemed really poignant to go back to the beginning.
And so tell me a little bit about his father then, because, I mean, a lot of us won't think that, we'll think of as Murdoch, okay, he's made a massive media empire, the largest in the world or the most influential in the world. But many of us will be, especially in the UK and Europe, unfamiliar with is it Sir Keith, his father?
Sir Keith, yeah, absolutely. So he's far from a household name outside of Australia, but in between sort of the 1920s and the early 1950s, Keith Murdoch was one of the biggest and most powerful newspaper men in Australia. He had really strong connections in the UK as well, and he'd sort of made his name as a cable journalist in London during the war. The First World War. He wrote this famous letter, the Gallipoli letter, which sort of tried to expose just the sort of bloodbath that was happening with Australian and New Zealand troops. And that got him in the door with Lord Northcliffe and some of these big press barons in the UK. And he basically used that influence, used that connection, used those lessons to come back to Australia, import the Northcliffe model. And over 30 years, he built up this company, the Herald and Weekly Times, into what was then one of Australia's biggest media empires. But this is the sort of rub that leads to Rupert inheriting it in an interesting position. He ran it, but he didn't own it. So he had to, his last few years of life, he really expended a lot of time, a lot of energy, doing some pretty, arguably underhanded tactics to try and carve out a little inheritance for Rupert to inherit. And it meant that when he died, all of his rivals and his colleagues, they were very, very keen to sort of claw all of that back and stop Rupert sort of coming into his own.
And what's the Australian media scene like back then? I mean, is it very sort of, is it independent? Is it conservative with a small c? Just wondering, because obviously that influences his father, will influence how Murdoch's worldview, if you like.
Yeah, well, Keith sort of started out quite idealistic. He first moved to London when he was in his early 20s and sort of failed, had to come back to Australia with his tail between his legs. So when he went back a second time and fell in with Lord Northcliffe, he really was very opportunistic and kind of cunning in a way. So he became this very powerful, quite conservative figure which makes Rupert's early sort of left-wing politics always seem like a sort of youthful rebellion against this big figure that his father was. But broadly speaking, all the big newspaper companies in Australia, and there were some big families like the Packers and the Simons and the Fairfaxes, they all leaned, were relatively right-leaning, centre-right-leaning with, a few, there were communist newspapers on sort of mucking about on the sides of the spectrum as well.
So the young Rupert then is left. I mean, how old is he? I mean, we'll talk about when he takes over the
So he's
the news.
He's 21 when Keith dies. He was studying at Oxford at the time, and he eventually finishes his studies and comes back to Adelaide a year later to take up the mantle of running this paper, which was the Adelaide News, was the paper that he eventually inherited, coming up against the Advertiser, which was the biggest paper in town, as it still is today. And that was part of his father's old empire, the Herald and Weekly Times. And they sort of did everything they could to try and squeeze Rupert and his paper that he inherited out of the market. So he's 22 when this all happened. And just in terms of the sort of perspective of Adelaide and its newspapers and its politics, Adelaide, for the sort of last couple of decades leading up to that period, had been run by this conservative establishment, the Liberal Party they're called, but they're Liberal and Country Party, but they were the sort of right-wing, centre-right-wing. And they basically were unchallenged because they had a gerrymander where country voters who voted for their party had twice the voting power as, Labor voting city dwellers. So, and they were in lockstep with the Advertiser. So it was this very kind of cosy, entrenched conservative establishment. And Rupert comes in, he's under the pump from his rivals across town who have all the influence and all the power, all the connections with the business world. And he and his editor, Rowan Rivett, decide to kind of stick it to him and really push this sort of left-wing progressive publication and try and speak to this demographic that wasn't being spoken to, this disenfranchised, progressive, diverse demographic, which later, the specifics of the kind of political leaning changes, but that kind of becomes a big part of the Murdoch playbook, is finding this demographic that's underserved, whether it's, left-wing people in Adelaide in the 50s or, conservative, middle-aged and older in America in the 90s with Fox News. That becomes the model. So you see it happen here in Adelaide.
It's interesting you mentioned Ronan Rivett, who is his editor-in-chief, because if you are going to make wholesale changes, or if you're going to take on the big boys, as they are at this point, you need to have an editor, because you can't edit it. If you're the publisher, people might think that you can do the whole thing, but you need a decent editor. And like you see that, I mean, I've read Piers Morgan's book, The Insider, and his relationship with Murdoch. Okay, this is in the 90s, but it's a team thing.
And it definitely, you really see that archetype of Murdoch. He has an editor that really is empowered to push the envelope and things with like The Sun and all those papers really sort of try and shake up the establishment. In the case of Rowan Rivett, he was the first editor that Rupert worked with, and he'd been installed by Keith Murdoch, who knew that Rowan Rivett was quite left-wing and probably had some misgivings, but thought he's the guy for the job. And he was actually really close with Rupert as a boy. Rowan had been a foreign correspondent in London for Keith's papers, and Keith had been asking Rowan to keep an eye on Rupert while he was at Oxford. So Rupert was almost like family in the Rivett household. And then when he gets sent back to Adelaide by Keith to sort of lay the groundwork for Rupert's eventual succession, it has all the makings of a very close and intimate partnership. And they really, for that 7 years, they're sort of working cheek by jowl to shake up Adelaide and make their mark. And they do that quite decisively, quite explosively by the end of that decade, because they get hauled before court in this sort of spectacular seditious libel trial. And then to complete the circle of Rupert's relationships with editors, inevitably he becomes the first editor that Rupert fires. So
he shakes up the very conservative Adelaide media market. I mean, circulation wars, attention-grabbing headlines, and you said they both ended up in court. So explain a little bit about how they went about that.
Yeah, so it ranges from small things like typography to even things like newspaper photography. This kind of, for a long time, there just hadn't been a big sort of challenge in the Adelaide newspaper market. So it had been lagging behind, while all around the world there were all these interesting new developments in newspaper and reporting and technology. And so this very intense period of competition kind of became like a crucible, really, both for Rupert but also for Australian newspapers, where suddenly they were looking around the world, identifying all these new techniques, these ways of telling stories, and importing them into this city. And so I remember there's one instance where a cricketer had been shot, like a sort of a crazed person had opened fire on a cricket match, and one cricketer had been killed. And Rowan had taken the sort of executive decision to put a photograph, because it had happened just in time for their afternoon print run, and they got the photograph. It was just near the city, and they put it on the front page, and you could sort of see the dead man sort of in frame, which totally scandalized Adelaide at the time. But everyone agreed that a newspaper editor that didn't run that photo, was probably up for being sacked, because it was just such an attention-grabbing photograph. But Adelaide at the time just wasn't really ready for it.
And this, the whole thing about going to court, obviously Murdoch doesn't show any qualms about it. It doesn't make him back down, and that lays the foundations for the rest of his career, basically, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, and also one of the first. Well, one of the documents that I found, because a lot of this, this will shock you, I'm sure, but Rupert wasn't available to be interviewed by me for the article, and most people that were alive are dead. So it was a lot of archival work, and there was this one batch of documents. It was from this trial, and it tells the scene. It's a police report of when Rupert or when these two detectives go and visit News Limited, the company's offices, and they interrogate Rowan Rivett, and then they come back and they interview Rupert. And for this whole period, he's been this very brash, kind of bolshy figure, but he's totally sort of chastened and, just sort of no comments his way through this whole interrogation. And then when they eventually end up in court, he does the same thing. And given when I first started looking into this, it was kind of at the height of the Leveson inquiry. And then it seemed, just as I was putting the final touches on it, we had, the Dominion lawsuits and all that coming through as well. So it seemed like there are these hinge points in the Murdoch story where, a huge crisis happens and he's forced to kind of front up and testify. And those are always very revealing moments. So the fact that the sort of climax of this story here in Adelaide ended with that moment as well just seemed really, really fitting.
Well, but the fascinating thing about this is the fact that, it'd be all very well if you go, I'm going to shake up the establishment, I'm going to do news like nobody's ever done, in Adelaide, et cetera, and that's fine. But you have to be able to say there's a market for this, there's an audience for this, because otherwise you look at the Morning Star and go, okay, we are singing Trotskyist songs on our soapboxes, but that's never going to get the readers and, more importantly, the advertisers. And this shows that Murdoch can spot a market, and as he goes on to, as you said before at the beginning of the interview, with Fox News, with the fact that the other papers such as that he takes over in the UK, he spots a market for them as well.
And I think by the end of that period, where he sees what the consequences are of pushing the envelope and challenging that establishment a little bit too far. They take his company to court, but the lessons of lighting a fire under a market and using those big, bold headlines and all those techniques, they remain a hallmark of the Murdoch model. The substance of the politics and the kind of message and audience that they're reaching out to changes, but, the way they're telling the story, which is, they call it's been called tabloid journalism now. And, Rupert didn't invent that, but his companies certainly became very adept at rolling that out on an industrial scale and sort of pushing the lowering the bar, I guess, and pushing the envelope in each new market they went to, and just kind of remaking it in the image of the Murdoch model. And the fact that they were able to do that in this era of kind of globalization of the second half of the 20th century meant that, there were other newspaper barons before him, sort of Yellow Press, Pulitzer, all those guys in America, Northcliffe even, but no one was able to do it all around the world. Which is why, this kind of story of Rupert is so remarkable. I
mean, he could have been a huge fish in a small pond, with the greatest respect to the fine city of Adelaide. But he, as we know, as history will write it, he goes on and he founds this global empire. What are there indications of that at the end of the 7 years with, in Adelaide? I mean, does he start, did you find going through documents that there is, I'm not saying there's a cunning plan for world domination, but are there hints that he will go on? He will go back to the UK where he's been at Oxford and take over papers there?
Well, there's so the first kind of big battle against the advertisers over the Sunday papers. So they both have these rival Sunday newspapers. And they both throw everything they have at it, but he realizes that the one thing he's lacking compared to the advertisers, they had this big network of Keith-sold companies. So he knew that to fight back and to survive, he had to expand. So he immediately started growing the company, bought up whatever he could just to get a foothold in a market from Perth in Western Australia. And then later on towards 1960, he went to Sydney and basically bought up whatever he could to get a foot in the door, and then use that to keep acquiring and sort of make his mark. So he was very hungry to grow from the get-go. But there was one interesting quote, and this comes from, I think, maybe 1957, 1958. It's when he's trying to expand into television for the first time, which, as we know, TV has become just this huge thing, a huge part of the Murdoch empire. And he's being interrogated about whether he's trying to build an empire of his own by trying to get a TV license for Perth. He just spent weeks trying to argue that he should be given the only TV license in Adelaide, because all the other interstate companies, shouldn't be able to have a sort of a monopoly or a nationwide TV empire. He then goes to Perth and tries to argue the exact opposite. And he says, and this is the quote, he says, "I have no plans for an empire. It just wouldn't interest me." So he's saying he isn't, but it's one of many points throughout this early Rupert period, but also I think you could say across his entire career, where he will kind of say whatever he needs to say to get him through whatever competition, whatever spot of bother, whatever interrogation he's currently under. If he's whatever he says to get through one challenge, it's true in the moment, and then it might not need to be true 5 minutes later.
How do you approach writing something about Murdoch, and how's your own view of him? Because obviously it's very easy if you're an independent to see Murdoch as to use Star Wars parlance as the emperor, isn't it? Especially as he's now of a certain age. This, and he seems to sum up all that is bad, you could say, in the media. I mean, I'm using that as this is a two-dimensional caricature I'm using. So please, Murdoch fans, don't throw things at me. But your own take on Murdoch, and then looking back at the young idealistic Murdoch, this left-wing leaning, which I certainly didn't know about, and I certainly didn't know about before reading about this book itself, about his backstory. I just thought he springs fully formed and takes over the world's media, basically. So what was your opinion of him, and did it change as you were researching and writing?
Yeah, totally. I mean, on the one hand, it was difficult to really get your head around what the interiority of him as a person might be, because he is just so responsive. He responds to whatever pressure he's under at a given time and says whatever he needs to say to get over that hurdle and move on to the next battle. So that was a challenge to see what he really felt or thought. But also, I think that kind of is a true reflection of the kind of person he is. He's very pragmatic, opportunistic, does and says what needs to be done to win the day and then move on. And that's how he's managed to get to grow all around the world. In terms of my own thoughts, I think a lot of people would be disappointed by how nuanced the book is, really, because the more I put him into that historical context and see that, he hasn't fallen out of the sky. He's grown out of this environment, and in response to this environment, this lineage of populist press barons who, he's learnt, it's trickled down from Northcliffe to his father to him, and he's perfected it, but he hasn't invented these things. And the fact that, as I said, he's been able to achieve it on an industrial scale, I think there is this level of toxicity that has existed in a lot of these populist newspapers right across history. But because he's been able to do it in a way that is totally unprecedented, means that it's just much more visible, that toxicity on this grander scale. I kind of equate it to, a lot of fish in the sea might have trace elements of mercury, and it's not going to kill you if you eat that fish, but it's the big apex predator that feasts on all the fish and ends up with, this toxic amount of mercury because it's consumed everything else. I think it's a bit like that. I'm still perfecting that analogy.
Yeah, no, I'll go with Murdoch the grouper fish of media circles. What do you hope that people discover about Murdoch? Because as you said, he didn't fall. I know that's an image I'll keep with me. Murdoch falling fully formed from the sky and taking over media. What do you hope that people perhaps understand him a bit better?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it puts a human face to these much bigger systems as well. I think the Rupert that we meet at the start of the book, who's very young and idealistic, he wouldn't have become a global media empire if he'd stuck to those ideals. The system is not made for those kinds of people. The system is made to reward those people who are very pragmatic and opportunistic and will, challenge, push good taste, maybe, chase the lowest common denominator if they need to, and kind of, to some degree, fail upwards. And also the fact that he had those connections. I think it was this kind of insider-outsider status, which you really get the sense of from this period and this book, is that he had all the privileges and access and opportunities that he had as being the son of a newspaper baron. But it was that spark, that kind of that frisson that came in Adelaide of being in opposition to this establishment that really lit a fire under him and set him in structural ways, but also in probably some kind of deep-seated psychological way as well, just this constant fight-back mentality. And he's still fighting and he's still railing against elites, even as he owns the biggest media company in the world, which I think is very telling.
When I interview editors of people who've written biographies, I just, I tend to think, is there a eureka moment, or is there as I call it, the drop the bacon sandwich moment, where you go, I wasn't expecting that, or I've got you and I can now form the book around you? Did you have one of those with Murdoch?
Not so much just Murdoch himself, but the more I read about, I think, and this is the spine of the book really, it's the relationship between him and Rowan Rivett, and the sort of evolution and the way they start so close together and end up so far apart. That shows you how Rupert has evolved. But the big eureka moment for me was I've been going through all their letters and correspondence for years now. And then this one day, maybe a year and a half ago, I was in the National Library in Canberra and I found this unpublished manuscript where Rowan Rivett had written a novel very, very thinly fictionalising those final years of his career with Rupert and that big seditious libel trial and their eventual breakup. And by that point, I'd read enough, court documents and private letters, so I could corroborate a lot of those scenes through other sources. And the fictionalization was, so thin as to be non-existent. It was verbatim. It's like he copied and pasted it, which led to these fascinating other scenes where I couldn't corroborate it, where it's just Rupert, the Rupert character. I think his name is Armand in the novel, and the Rivett character is Donald, where, it's just so telling and so fascinating to see this kind of the last fight argument they have before the big split. But of course, there's no way. There's only one man alive who can possibly corroborate it. And as I said, he hasn't got back to me. So that was a really fascinating source.
The book is called Young Rupert, The Making of the Murdoch Empire. It's by Walter Marsh, who we're talking to today. Walter, if people want to find you online, where can they find you?
Yeah, just Google Walter Marsh. There's a murderer with my name as well. I'm not that guy. But yeah, waltermarsh.com.au, and the book is out pretty much everywhere through Scribe. And
you'll be able to also order it via our own virtual bookstore. Fascinating. The book's called Young Rupert, The Making of the Murdoch Empire. It's by Walter Marsh. Walter, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Giles.